Now we're going to talk about the Roman Republic. The history of Rome is broken up into two great eras. There's the Roman Republic, which is going to last for about 500 years roughly, and then there's the Roman Empire, which we'll cover later, which also lasts for almost 500 years. Here are the terms. Make sure you get them all, and then listen for them as we move forward. So here you see a map of Europe, and if you look down towards the bottom, you see the peninsula of Italy, and that's where Rome is. Rome is really important in understanding the development of Western and world civilization. Why? Well, some of the reasons are that in many ways, Rome is the last great ancient civilization. There's going to be a big divide after the fall of Rome that we call the Dark Ages. And we like to think of the ancient world leading up to Rome, followed by the medieval and modern worlds. But the divide is not as important as earlier historians believed. We now know that there were lots of connections and continuity. And we'll look at how knowledge of the ancient world and its culture survived and was passed down to later societies. Rome represents one of the ways that ideas about government, religion, literary tradition, philosophy, and science from the Near East and Israel and Greece were all preserved and transmitted to Europe. Rome is an important link in the chain. Also, Rome becomes a model in later Europe in many ways. The American government was modeled in many ways on the Roman Republic. And in the great rebirth of interest in the ancient world during the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment, people are looking at Rome before they look at Greece. They were convinced that Rome was the height of civilization in the past. The thing to keep in mind about Rome is that it means a number of different things. And we'll talk about two main divisions in this lecture and then the next lecture, and that's the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. But now we're going to look at Rome as a city-state of a kind that you should be familiar with because we've been talking about city-states of the ancient world. Rome starts off as an urban civilization and then it begins to grow, but it maintains its essentially city-like character for several hundred years. Rome goes through some big changes, and by the 1st century BC, it has metamorphosized into a city that's ruling an empire. But it doesn't really go through its final changes until a period of crisis, when its institutions are no longer able to govern the large empire it's acquired. Rome's government collapses and has to be rebuilt. So, from a political point of view, we see the Republic, a period of crisis, and then a long period of empire. Institutions change and develop to come to grips with this large empire and the peoples that have been incorporated into it. So we use Republic and Empire to describe these two major divisions. But the thing is, it's really not a neat division. Rome starts to become an empire while it is still governed as a republic. So politically it's still a republic, even though they're acquiring land and gaining an empire. Then it throws off the republic and starts a new set of institutions to govern this large empire it's acquired. And then that empire continues for roughly 5 centuries until the whole thing collapses. We see cultural changes as well, as Rome grows from a city where you know your neighbors to an empire with diverse people exchanging ideas. But why Rome? Why did this little nowhere place grow to become the center of a huge empire? Well, we've moved westward in our view of the world. And even though it still has thriving cultures, the area that we've been talking about now is on the margins, and our point of view for this lecture is going to be the Mediterranean basin. So we're talking about a culture that grows up in the context of this giant sea, which serves as a highway of sorts, a way of transporting goods and ideas. Trade is the background against which culture and civilization spread. And we see this with pretty much all of the civilizations that we've looked at to date, because people are out there, they're trading, they're coming into contact with different cultures and sharing ideas and goods. And that's what we see happening here. We see an important exchange point in the central Mediterranean between Sicily and Africa. The Greeks took over Sicily and southern Italy as they moved west, and they made their way up the toe and the boot of Italy, coming into contact with the various peoples who lived in Italy, and also southern France and Spain. But who were these people? Here you see ancient Italy, and as you can see, it's divided, and each of these names represents a group or a tribe of people who lives in that territory. And if you notice up towards the northern part of Italy, you see Etruscan. The Etruscans were the dominant people, and they weren't really that closely related to the Latins, another tribe of people who lived in this area. We know that the Etruscans spoke a different language as opposed to the Indo-European language spoken by the Latins. We know that the Etruscans were more settled than some of the other people living in Italy, and we know that they came into contact with the Greeks a lot and were influenced by their city dwelling, their art, and just many aspects of their culture. The bulk of Etruscan cities were north of Rome. And the Etruscans, like I said, they're influenced from very early on by the Greeks, and they tried to emulate the Greeks. For example, we see the Greek influence in Etruscan pottery. Here you see on the left an example of Etruscan pottery, and on the right the Greek. And as you can see, the style is pretty much the same, the coloration, the materials used, the artistry. Here you see another example of Etruscan art. We know that the Etruscans learned to write. We're not sure we understand all of their language, but it's clear they picked up the basic idea of alphabet and writing from the Greeks. The Etruscans may have actually then passed writing on to the Romans, or it's possible the Romans learned it directly from the Greeks. We're just not sure. But we do know that the Etruscans were a literate people. They kept writing, or they kept written records. They became very prominent in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. So we're still left with the question, why Rome? Why not the Etruscans? Well, one reason for that is that the Etruscans initially, they're very powerful. They are creating all these city-states up in the northern part of Italy. They're ruled by a king, but these city-states appear to have been in constant conflict with each other. And they're kind of like the Greeks in that regard. And just as in the great period of Greek city-states, the Etruscans are often at war with one another, and that uses their resources, and that means that they weaken themselves. And I always kind of think about them in relation to the movie WALL-E, the Disney movie. I don't know if you've ever seen it, because what happens is the Etruscans go from being this pretty strong and powerful people to these people who have become so successful that they're just kind of resting on their laurels and they become weak. And so if you think of the movie WALL-E, if you've seen it, think of how the humans are portrayed in that movie. They become so successful that they didn't have to work anymore. And then look what happens. Look how weak they become. That's what happens with the Etruscans. And Rome, the city, is going to emerge in Etruscan territory. And the Romans are eventually going to become tired of Etruscan rule. So how does Rome start? So here you see the territory controlled by the Etruscans. So you see the core area, like the dark gold, called Etruria, but then they begin expanding. So all those areas in tan, those are areas that are eventually going to be controlled by the Etruscans. And as you can see, Rome is on the fringes. So how does Rome begin? Well, the traditional founding of Rome dates to April 21st of 753 BC, with a story told by the Romans about two brothers, Romulus and Remus. They were the twin sons of Mars, the god, and a Vestal virgin who were raised by she-wolves. And according to the story, they wanted to found a city, but they couldn't agree on where to settle. They each had a different location, and so, as brothers do, they fought, and Romulus kills his brother Remus. And then he goes on to establish his city along the Tiber River, and it's named after him, Rome. So according to the city, and much of this is actually true, the city of Rome is established, but it needs inhabitants. And so Romulus invites people to come and settle. He invites anyone who wants to settle in Rome to do so. And the first group of settlers was a group of convicts. And basically, people are being told, hey, you're not wanted anyone else. We have this great opportunity here for you in this place called Rome. Why don't you come? And people came. So they have men, but they need women. So what do you do when you need women? Well, you just go kidnap some. There was a neighboring tribe called the Sabines, and the Romans went and kidnapped their women. So it's kind of an unsavory start to a city if you think about it. You've got fratricide, you've got convicts and the unwanted, and you've got kidnapping. But what we know is that this wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because you've got these people who have come here and settled, and they're from a variety of backgrounds and in some cases cultures, and they bring with them a variety of ideas. And so it's almost like you have this explosion of ideas that come together to create something new and great. And it's really interesting because later Roman writers always seemed to believe that Rome was destined to be great. But if you look at the evidence from the beginning, there's not a lot of support for why Rome might rise to glory. We do know that it was a long and extremely slow process that was dominated early on by a monarchy. And the monarchy was the kings of the Etruscans. So, as I said earlier, initially Rome is part of the Etruscan territory, but they get tired of the oppression of the Etruscan kings. So what happens? Well, in 509 BC, some records indicate 510 BC, the Romans rose up against the Etruscans and drove out the hated Etruscan king. So now they're independent, and they had to establish a new government, but they didn't want to be ruled by a king. They didn't want another tyrannical ruler. They just got rid of one. So instead of a bossy monarch, they created a republic, a representative government. And so republic meant a thing of the people. So we have a republic, and the people are going to be involved. Now, as time passes, the people also realized they needed law and order. And so the Romans decided that they needed a system of laws that could be understood by everybody and under which everybody was equally protected. And this is going to be the 12 tables, so called because it was on 12 tablets. And this is in 450 BC. So this contains Rome's law codes. And these are one of the greatest legacies of Rome. When you think of Rome's legacies, the law code is one of the first things that springs to mind for many people. The 12 tables served as a mini constitution, guaranteeing things like the right to a trial by jury, the right to appeal a decision of one court to a higher court. And it was the first time ideas and rights like these were articulated. So this was very instrumental. This was really instrumental in laying the foundation for the government that's going to grow here in the Roman Republic. Now, the Romans realized that even though they didn't want a monarch, they needed some kind of manager for the government. So they opted for consuls. There would be 2 consuls for most of the Roman Republic, and they wanted 2 because they wanted a balance of power. They didn't want any one person having all of the power. Now we also see class distinctions. The top 10% were aristocrats known as patricians, and they tended to dominate the government of Rome for hundreds of years, controlling one and generally both of the consuls. Then they had the Senate. The Roman Senate was peopled exclusively by patricians. So they're calling all the shots as consuls, like the executives of the government, and as members of the Senate, the advisory body. The real legislative and foreign policy power in Rome, in the Republic, lay in the Senate. Now, initially, there's not much of a middle class. So you have the patricians who are dominating the government, and then you had the plebeians. Now, the plebeians often had no permanent dwellings. Many of them lived in tenement structures, which were all over Rome. And this is 90% of the population. So 10% is the patricians, 90% is the plebeians. And this is going to become important. These numbers are going to become important because people in charge are going to realize that it's very hard to keep 90% of the population happy. Well, in addition to the Senate, there was the Popular Assembly. And the assembly was this huge assembly to which all Roman citizens, and this is men we're talking about, plebeians as well as patricians, could go to vote on items placed before them by the Senate. So the Senate and the assembly provided a system of checks and balances that was supposed to prevent any single group from having all the power. Now, the downside is that it can also lead to a gridlock when they just can't agree, and that happened quite often. Most of Rome's early attention was devoted to military affairs because they began slowly but surely conquering the rest of the northern part of Italy. They also are threatened by various barbarian tribes that are threatening the city. So Rome made a decision to revamp its army to a new form. And the new style of fighting established by the Roman Republic was a much more ferocious and barbarous style than the Greek hoplite phalanx. The new Roman army was composed of legions, and each legion had about 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers, and there were usually about 30 legions in the army. And these legions could be divided up into what were called maniples. The maniple was a small infantry unit, about 120 men, and they could, because they're much more flexible in these smaller groups, and so they could position them or organize them on the battlefield I say here in a checkerboard fashion. Picture a checkerboard with each of those little squares being a maniple. And here you see the Greek hoplite phalanx, very powerful, and then across you see the maniple, the legions broken up. And so think of the flexibility. The hoplite phalanx is very powerful, but they're not very maneuverable, whereas the maniples are. They can go around, they can, go behind the phalanx, whatever. Now, we also, in addition to seeing this new layout, this new form of fighting, which could actually, or organization, which could actually spread over a 5 square mile area, we see the Roman legions carrying some new weapons that they thought were more suitable to their new style of warfare. One was a 6 foot long spear that had a collapsible tip. So this was very helpful to the Romans. It actually gave them an advantage, because what happened a lot of times in warfare was somebody would throw a spear, miss his target, the other side would pick it up and throw it back. They have a weapon. Well, this new spear, if it missed its target and just say glanced off a tree or just fell on the ground, the tip would collapse. So the other side could pick it up and throw it back, but essentially they're just throwing a stick. And so this combination of the new form and the new weapons just wreaked havoc on the battlefield. And Roman legions were remarkably successful, as nobody was ready for this new ferocity in warfare. And so between 510 and 390 BC, Rome conquered most of northern Italy and then began to push down the Italian peninsula. Rome's ambition led her into conflict with Carthage. Carthage was not happy about Rome's increasing presence. Now, Carthage was a city, now an empire, originally settled as a Phoenician colony. But by the 3rd century BC, it had developed into a very successful city-state on its own. And this is around present-day Tunisia in Africa. So Carthage has an empire, and they're Rome's major rival, and the two, Carthage and Rome, are going to battle for dominance of the Mediterranean in a series of wars. So here you see the territory initially controlled by each. So you see Rome, the red, on the Italian peninsula, and then you can see the territory controlled by Carthage, which, if you notice, is quite sizable, even part of Spain. And so what happens is the Romans start moving down the peninsula of Italy, conquering as they go. Then they decide they want Sicily. And in trying to conquer Sicily, they bump into Carthage. If you notice by looking at this map, part of Sicily is purple, meaning that's part of the Carthaginian Empire. Carthage had a pretty sizable land empire, and it wasn't only a dominant military power with a great battlefield record, but also a great naval power, because they're descended from the Phoenicians, these great sea traders. Also, Carthaginian generals had a lot of incentive to win, because losing generals would be crucified. So what ends up happening is that the Romans are going to push their way into Sicily. Now, part of Sicily was controlled by Carthage. The other part of Sicily was dominated by Greek settlers, colonists. And those Greeks cry out to the Carthaginians for help. It's like, help, help, the Romans are here. Protect us. And this is what's going to lead Rome into war with Carthage in this series of wars that erupt between expansionist Rome and Carthage. And they're known as the Punic Wars. Punic because Punica was Latin for Phoenician. So the First Punic War is fought over Sicily. And it's really interesting because, as I mentioned, Carthage had this great navy. And initially, Rome didn't even have a navy, but they ended up developing one. It was pretty ingenious, actually. They found a wrecked Carthaginian ship and they took it apart and studied its design and then copied the design in order to match and meet Carthage. And they ended up building an entire fleet of ships based on the Carthaginian design. But they added some new technology that gave them an advantage. For example, as you can maybe see with this picture, ships back then had gangplanks or gangways. And normally what would happen would be a ship would come up alongside or parallel to an enemy ship, put out the gangplank, board the other ship, try to take control. Well, what the Romans did was they used that model, but their gangplank would swivel. And so that meant they didn't have to be exactly parallel to the other ship. Add to that, they put grappling hooks on their ships. So if they came close to another ship, they could throw out those grappling hooks, reel themselves close to the ship, swivel out that gangway, board and seize the enemy ship almost before the the other people knew what was going on. And so as a result of this new technology and the legions and the new navy, Rome is victorious in the First Punic War. And the big prize was Sicily. Rome takes Sicily for itself and begins to administer it as a province. And Carthage has to pay tribute to Rome because they lost the war. And this was Rome's first step towards worldwide empire. Carthage, however, they signed a treaty at the end of this war, agreeing. They're like, okay, you won, we'll pay. But they're furious. And Carthage doesn't want to take this lying down. They ached for revenge. One of those individuals who particularly wanted to strike back was a brilliant general named Hannibal. Now, legend had it that when Hannibal was a boy, his father, who was a great general on his own, took him to an altar of the gods and made him swear an oath to be an enemy of the Roman people. And whether that happened or not, we do know that Hannibal dedicated his life to the destruction of Rome. Now, he grew up surrounded by the military because his father was a general, and Hannibal developed some unique ideas and imaginative battlefield techniques. For example, he would attach torches to the horns of cattle at night and then send cattle into Roman camps. He would fight at night. Usually you didn't fight at night, you fought during the daylight. He just had natural military abilities. And he had grown up in a military outpost on the eastern coast of Spain. So if you look at this map, you see Rome, you see Carthage, this great sea power. You would assume that Carthage, if they truly want this revenge, they're going to go back to Rome by sea. Well, Hannibal knew that that's exactly what the Romans were expecting. So he did something different. Hannibal's idea was to attack Rome from the north rather than to try to wage war by coming from the south, the Mediterranean Sea. He felt that if Rome were to be defeated, the best way would be a strategic campaign that would come down from the north. And so this is what he does. If you look at this map, you can see that he begins in Spain, makes his way through Gaul, that's what's today France, and has to cross a mountain range called the Pyrenees, comes into northern Italy, crossing the Alps, and then down into the Italian peninsula. And even though he did have to cross the Alps, Hannibal couldn't be dissuaded. And so picture this, 37 battle elephants strolling out of the Alps and down the Italian peninsula. In 218 BC, Hannibal embarked on one of the most daring military expeditions in history. As you saw on the map, he set out from Spain. He led his troops, including dozens of war elephants, in a march across the Pyrenees Mountains, through France, over the huge peaks of the Alps, into Italy. The Roman historian Livy described the descent down the Alps' steep slopes. Here's what he said. The whole way was narrow and slippery, so that the soldiers could not prevent their feet from sliding, nor, if they made the least false step, could they, on falling, stop themselves in the place. And thus men and beasts tumbled confusedly over one another. Whenever they attempted to rise, either by aid of the hands or knees, these slipping, they fell again. Add to this that there were neither stumps nor roots within reach on which they could lean for support, so that they wallowed in the melted snow on one entire surface of slippery ice. Now that's dedication. The trek across the Alps lasted 15 days, and it cost Hannibal nearly half his army and a good majority of his elephants. But he did end up achieving his goal. The Romans had expected an invasion from the south through Sicily, but this bold attack through the Alps caught them completely off guard. And so we come to the Second Punic War. So Hannibal's invasion marks the beginning of the Second Punic War. And as you can see, it lasted for 17 years. What happens initially is that Hannibal and his army are basically just roaming through Italy, attacking this village, destroying this farmland, conquering and attacking this city, or attacking and conquering this city. And the Romans just couldn't stop them. And it went on for more than a decade. And finally, the Romans are like, we've got to get a handle on this. So they send a brilliant Roman general named Scipio to handle the situation. So Scipio takes control of the Roman army, and he evaluates the situation. And the situation is that Hannibal is destroying large parts of Italy and, and destroying farmland and just keeping the constant warfare going. It's also destroying the economy. So Scipio realizes that if he takes his army down to Carthage, Hannibal will be forced to follow. And that's what he does. So Scipio begins his African campaign, where he brings the Roman army down to North Africa, begins slowly but surely conquering Carthaginian territory. Until finally, Scipio and Hannibal meet in battle on a plain outside Carthage at the Battle of Zama. Now, Hannibal thought that he would have an advantage in his war elephants, but it actually backfired on him. Scipio had trained his soldiers to use a certain technique when the elephants came charging towards them, to raise their shields and then kind of get in a cluster, so that, in a line, so that the elephants would go past them. And so they're not putting up a united front where the elephants would come and break them up. And that, combined with the noise that the Romans made as they screamed and sang and they banged their swords on their shields, just kind of freaked the elephants out and ended up creating more chaos in the Carthaginian lines than it did in the Roman lines. And so, end result, this is a huge victory for Rome. And Carthage, as a result, is defeated soundly and loses its empire to Rome. And so this is considered to be one of the most significant battles in history. It provides the next step to Rome's conquest of the Mediterranean, because now, for the first time, Rome is controlling territory outside of Italy. It started with Sicily, but now Rome is controlling North Africa, Spain, and other territories that used to belong to Carthage. And this is just the beginning of Rome's move to acquire an empire. So you would think that would be the end of it. Carthage is destroyed. Rome was victorious. They gained the territory. Carthage again has to pay tribute to Rome, and that should have been the end of it. But there were Romans who, even decades after the war, were still so furious that Carthage, under Hannibal, had dared to enter their territory, that they just couldn't get over it. And the leader of these people was Cato. Cato was a Roman senator, and he would show up at the Senate every day just chanting, Carthage must be destroyed. Carthage must be destroyed. It's like he just couldn't rest knowing that Carthage was still down there and still somewhat independent. And so eventually his ideas began to spread through Rome, and you'd like walk through the streets and hear people chanting, Carthage must be destroyed, because they're just so bitter. And he time and again tried to convince the Roman Senate to send the Roman army back down to Carthage, until finally he's successful. The result is the Third Punic War. Now, you'll notice by the dates that this war is nowhere near as long as the first two, and this is because Carthage was in no position to fight back, really. They were still weakened even decades later by the aftermath of the Second Punic War. And now, with this war, we have the Roman army advancing on Carthage. They set the city on fire and burn it to the ground. For good measure, the territory around the city was plowed up and salt was sowed into the ground so that no crops could be grown there for a very long time. Carthage is soundly defeated, for good. This final defeat of Carthage led to enormous riches being taken back to Rome. But as we'll see, this wealth was not distributed fairly. And so the Punic Wars are very, very important to Rome's history because, as I say here, they result in Rome's domination of the Mediterranean and the beginning of her empire. So Rome is gaining territory, it's becoming very wealthy, but as I mentioned, that wealth is not being distributed evenly, and wars were expensive. So who's paying for it? Well, mainly the poor in Rome. They were bearing more than their fair share of the costs. So the Gracchus brothers rose up to speak in favor of the poor and against the manner in which the rich continued to hoard the wealth. So they were Roman senators who wanted to pass reforms to help the poor. Tiberius was elected tribune in 133 BC, and he called on the state to distribute land to poor farmers. He described their plight in moving words. He said, even the wild beasts that roam over Italy have a cave to sleep in, but the men who fight and die for Rome enjoy only the light, nothing else. They and their wives and children wander around homeless. So why are there so many homeless people in Rome? Well, one reason for this was that in the beginning, farmers would do their duty in the military for just a matter of months, then they came home. But then, as Rome continues expanding and fighting, the length of time away grows into years. Think of the Punic Wars lasting more than a decade. And in many cases, the farmers' wives and children, without the husbands or fathers there to farm and take care of everything, just couldn't keep up with the work. They couldn't pay the taxes. They lose their farms, their livelihoods. So the soldier, who's a farmer, he's a citizen, returns home to find nothing. So Tiberius wants to help them. Well, he's assassinated by fellow aristocrats who don't like his message. But the torch of social reform passes to his younger brother Gaius, who begins to institute real change in Rome. So what does he do? Well, he saw to it that land was redistributed. The state would confiscate land from large landholders and redistribute it for communal-style farms. He also authorized the state to buy grain cheaply overseas and sell it to the poor at below market prices. And this was important because the poor were literally starving to death because the only grain that was available for purchase was grain being sold by many of the aristocrats. They had a monopoly on it, and they could put whatever price they wanted on it, which was usually pretty high. He also cultivated Rome's growing business class. He was a smart politician who stroked the middle class, this growing middle business class that starts to emerge. Unfortunately, he ends up holding the position of consul, and he overstepped the boundaries of his office when he stood for re-election, when it was illegal to stand for perpetual re-election. And he made a lot of enemies. Now, one result of the social reforms was to create a social instability and the fracturing of Rome. We see political opinion divided into two camps. There were those who wanted to help the poor. And then there were those who thought that things were just fine with the aristocrats on top. Well, the reforms angered the Senate. They saw them as a threat to their power. And so they pushed for legislation allowing them to do whatever was necessary to protect Rome. So if you think about it, you can interpret that in many ways. And the way that many interpreted it was assassination. So for the next 100 years, we see a series of civil wars over who should hold power. Should it be the Senate? Or should it be popular political leaders like the Gracchus brothers who want reforms? But before additional reforms could take place, Rome runs into a problem. So the Romans throughout the 1st century BC are continuing to expand. And if you look at this map, you can see the territory they're controlling during this period of time. They've really enlarged their territory. But who's living in that territory? Well, there's tribal people living in all of these areas. And in order to conquer these areas, the Romans have to conquer these people. One of these groups was the Celts. The Celts were especially unnerving on the field of battle. They were very imposing. They were often taller than the average Roman. They fought naked. They painted their bodies blue, and they would eat you if they defeated you. Add to that, they would race into battle, screaming at the top of their lungs, waving their spears and their shields, and this was just totally unnerving for the Romans who weren't used to this style of battle. So, the Roman Senate decided that it needed someone, a strong general, to defeat the savages. And they appoint someone to take care of the Celts, a general by the name of Marius, and he's going to turn the tide against the Celtic invasion. So I left off talking about the Celts and the Celtic invasion, which the Roman army just couldn't stop. And I mentioned that the Roman Senate decided that maybe they needed a strong general to defeat these savages. So the general that the Senate appointed to take care of the Celts was Marius. Now, Marius is really important because he is going to end up turning the tide against the Celtic invasion. So who was he? Well, he was a patrician, but he sympathized with the plight of the poor. In order to get sufficient soldiers or recruits, he did something that no one else had ever done. He offered land to his soldiers and benefits to veterans. And this was really important because if you lived in the Roman Republic at this time,
And if you didn't own land, you were just considered trash, riffraff. And so this offer of land was a very attractive bonus, one that would set you apart from the ordinary plebeian. And now Marius is setting a new precedent, a dangerous precedent, because now what we see are soldiers whose first loyalty was to their commanders and not to Rome. Well, by doing this, Marius was able to attract quite a number of displaced poor, and he turned his military prowess into political power. He was elected consul 6 times, and this is in 107 BC. And he was elected 6 times even though there was a constitutional prohibition against it. And so in the career of Marius, we can kind of get a sense of what's to come, meaning politicians who just kind of disregard the law because in their minds they're needed. In their minds, they're doing what they're doing to protect Rome. Marius himself said, quote, "In the din of arms, I could not hear the voice of law." Now, because he had rewarded the poor, he aroused the antagonism of the wealthy and those whose land was being confiscated. Because if you think about it, he's giving all this land to the plebeians. Where's it coming from? Well, he's seizing it from patricians. As a result, we see more divisions emerging in society, and 2 opposing political parties emerged. We've got those who agreed with Marius that the poor should be getting more, and so represented the needs and wishes of the ordinary people, and they came to be known as the populares, and they were called this because they represented popular will, or the will of the people. And the populares at least gave lip service to the needs of the poor. Their opponents, who were pretty much almost all aristocrats, thought that the best or richest people should be in charge. And I did not mean to say pretty much all aristocrats. They were all aristocrats. And they were known as the optimates, the best. And they became the party representing the conservatives. Well, both of these political parties had military power behind them. The leaders commanded their own armies who were loyal to them. So what happens is that Marius is going to rule until he dies in office, and then a reign of terror follows. You've got rival generals commanding their own armies. They fight each other for power. And the rival general who represented the optimates was Sulla. So who was Sulla? Well, Sulla was fed up with all of the compromises that had been made to help the poor. And he succeeded Marius as consul, and this was in 88 BC. And he offered a reward for the head of any follower of Marius. Sulla becomes a pretty terrible dictator, even more than Marius had been. And Sulla said he stood for the Constitution, but he didn't really. The crisis that caused the fall of the Roman Republic was caused by the role of the military in Roman life. They didn't separate the military from the political scene. Generals were able to seize the reins of civilian power and failed to recognize the gulf that should have separated the two. Sulla ends up ruling for 10 years. He dies in 78 BC, and he is succeeded by his first lieutenant, a man named Pompey. So, as I just said, Sulla rules for 10 years, and he becomes a pretty terrible dictator. But then when he dies, he's succeeded by his first lieutenant. So, Sulla was succeeded by his first lieutenant, known as Pompey, or Pompey the Great. And he was called Pompey the Great because he told everyone to call him that. So, Pompey assumes power, but the death of Sulla marked a moment for the populares when they could recapture their power. And this was just a dangerous time because aristocrats were pretty vulnerable at this time. The populares urged civil unrest and uprisings, and Rome was headed towards civil war. Another group who saw the death of Sulla as an opportune time to act were the Roman slaves. Hearing of the death of Sulla, the slaves decided that it was the time to revolt. Now, there were slaves all over Roman territory. Slavery was very widespread. Mostly conquered people, people who were conquered in warfare, inhabitants of land that used to be free but now was part of Roman territory. And they weren't always treated very well by the Romans. And so all across the Roman territory, the slaves rose up in rebellion. And they were headed by or led by a slave named Spartacus. And it's actually likely that there were several slaves who led the uprising, but Spartacus is the one we know. And the slave revolt lasted for more than a year. So the revolt kept spreading and spreading and growing and growing. And the Romans were just really getting freaked out because they couldn't put it down. In some areas, the slaves actually outnumbered the Romans. And so the Senate got involved. The Senate elected a wealthy man named Crassus to put down the slave rebellion. So Crassus was a military man, just as Pompey had been, but he had also become one of the wealthiest men in Rome. And the way he did this was that he was a slumlord. He would build all these tenements, basically, and then rent them out to the poor at very high prices, and he made a lot of money for himself. But now he takes command of his army, and he goes out to put down the slave rebellion, and he's very successful. He uses a lot of brutality, but he ends up suppressing the slave rebellion. To make a point, Crassus crucified more than 5,000 slaves. They were crucified on the main road to downtown Rome as a lesson to other slaves, basically sending the message that this is what will happen to you if you rebel. As a result of this success, Crassus's wealth and power increased, as did the reputation of Pompey, who was at the same time accumulating more and more territory for Rome. So you have these two men who are military men, they're generals, they command their own armies, they become involved in politics, and they just become very well known and very successful. A third rising star was the nephew of Marius, and actually Marius's political and military successor. And this was a young man named Julius Caesar. He had pretty much kept his mouth shut about his political aspirations, and he needed to be rewarded for refusing to speak out in favor of the populares. So when it looked as if Rome was going to come apart at the seams with civil war, a three-corner alliance was put together. Now, this was totally illegal and in violation of the Roman constitution. And it was illegal because you have three men coming together to seize power. And the constitution specified that there would only be two at one time, the two consuls. But nevertheless, these three men come together. Three leaders come together and they form what's known as the First Triumvirate. And this is Julius Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey. And the First Triumvirate is formed in 60 BC. Really, what it was a conspiracy to run the state. Now, the First Triumvirate was both a personal and a political alliance. Members of the alliance tried to cement their relationship through intermarriage. But, unfortunately, the friendship that underlay the alliance broke down because of the individual ambition of the three men. Because you have these three men who, on the surface, they're working together for the good of Rome, but in reality, each of them is so ambitious that they want power for themselves. And so, even as they're ostensibly working together, they're also working to gain more power for themselves. And along the way, Crassus ends up dying in battle. So that leaves Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, and they agree to work together. So Pompey's back in Rome, ruling, and Caesar, a military man, sets off for Gaul, which is present-day France, in 59 BC. And he's there for nearly 9 years, and was able to conquer this territory and add it to Rome's expanding empire. Now, again, they're not an empire politically, but land-wise, they're an empire. Unbeknownst to Caesar, while he's in Gaul conquering the land, Pompey's back in Rome working to have himself declared sole consul. And when the Senate ends up agreeing to allow Pompey the title of sole consul, word gets to Caesar and he is furious. And so he takes his army and heads back to Rome. Now, these two men were very, very ambitious. To give you an idea of their feelings for one another, here's what Pompey had to say about Caesar. "If it were not for Caesar, I should be the greatest man in Rome." And here's what Caesar had to say about Pompey. "If it were not for Pompey, I should rule the world. There is no virtue in the republic. It is near to its end. The time has come for one man to take command over all, and why should I not be that man?" So Caesar is furious, and he marches on Rome with his army. Now, in order to get there, he crosses the Rubicon River. And this is very important. The Rubicon River is outside of Rome, and it marked a boundary of sorts between Roman territory and some other territory. And the rule was that you could not cross the Rubicon at the head of an army, for example, a general leading his army, unless you had been specifically appointed to govern in that territory by the Senate. Now, Caesar had not been appointed, and the law was that if you crossed the Rubicon with your army, especially with the intent of marching on Rome, you and your soldiers were outlaws. But Caesar was so furious that he marched on Rome nevertheless, crossing the Rubicon with his army to seek out Pompey. Well, he gets to Rome and discovers that Pompey has fled. Pompey hears he's coming, and so Pompey and his army and half of the Senate, those who supported Pompey, they're gone. And this begins a cat and mouse chase across various parts of Europe as Caesar tries to track down Pompey. And eventually, his chase leads him down to Egypt, where he is successful, and Pompey ends up being defeated and assassinated down in Egypt. During the struggle, Caesar left Rome in the hands of his right-hand man, Mark Antony. And while he's down in Egypt, he ends up striking up a friendship with the ruler, Cleopatra. Now, the story goes that Cleopatra was in hiding, and this is true. The pharaoh had died and decreed that his son and daughter should marry each other and rule jointly. Well, Cleopatra's the daughter. She doesn't want to rule with her brother. Her brother doesn't want to rule with her. They want to rule on their own. And so, civil war. They're fighting each other, and Cleopatra is actually in hiding when Julius Caesar arrives. So the story goes that, and there is some proof to lead us to believe that this actually happened, but Julius Caesar's in his big fancy tent down in Egypt, and he is told that there's a gift that has arrived for him, and he's like, okay, bring it in. And so these soldiers carry this rolled up carpet into the tent, and they unroll it, and it unrolls and unrolls and unrolls all the way across the tent till it's open, and hidden inside is Cleopatra. And Caesar is going to end up striking up more than a friendship with Cleopatra. In fact, he and Cleopatra end up falling in love. We have a love affair. So, why? Well, each of them could help the other. Egypt was a very wealthy country, and Caesar hoped that he could use those resources to help Rome, to help him build his power with Rome. Cleopatra, she's at war with her brother. She wants power. Here's Julius Caesar, this great military man who, incidentally, was considered to be one of the greatest military geniuses who ever lived. He could help her. So they have an affair. he ends up bringing her back to Rome, and their affair scandalized everyone, especially when you look at the fact that Cleopatra bore him an illegitimate son. So when he arrives back in Rome, Caesar's posing as a moral hero to the people, and the fact that he brings his mistress and has an illegitimate son makes it kind of hard for him to do this, because he's already married. He has a wife. But nevertheless, he brings her back. And he ends up persuading the Senate to declare him consul for life. So initially he's consul, and very popular among the people, because while he's consul, over a period of several years, he actually does pass quite a few reforms that benefit the people. But then his quest for power got the best of him, and he asks the Senate or persuades them to declare him consul for life. And ultimately, this is going to be his undoing. Essentially, what Caesar had done was create a dictatorship. There were many within the Senate who were really afraid of his growing power, and once he becomes dictator for life, they just see that power growing and growing and growing, and they don't want that to happen. And so, on the Ides of March 15th, 44 BC, Caesar heads to the Senate just as he always does. Now, he had been warned by his favorite soothsayer to, quote, "Don't go out tonight. You're bound to lose your life. There's a bad moon on the rise." Maybe he should have listened, because he goes to the Senate and ends up being stabbed to death by other senators. He's stabbed 23 times and is murdered there on the Senate floor. And ironically, he is murdered at the foot of a statue of Pompey the Great. Well, a historian who lived in Alexandria about 150 AD wrote about the declining years of the Roman Republic. Conquering an empire, he said, had created strains and conflicts in Roman society. He wrote, quote, "The powerful ones become enormously rich, and the race of slaves multiplied throughout the country, while the Italian people dwindled in numbers and strength, being oppressed by poverty, taxes, and military service." And in the end, the triumphant Romans tore their state apart. Ambitious generals battled for power, and their struggles crushed the republic. What happens is that Caesar's assassinated, and his assassins, all they knew was they wanted to get rid of him, get him out of the picture. They did not have a plan in place. And so the result of that is going to be 17 years of civil war, with rival politicians and generals fighting for power. Out of that rubble, though, is going to rise the Roman Empire and a new chapter in Rome's long history. So if you look at the Roman Republic, the problems that you see are the huge and growing division between rich and poor that starts really centuries back with the Punic Wars. Remember all that wealth that's brought back into Rome, but not really distributed evenly. So you've got that growing divide. You've got a lot of very unhappy plebeians, very resentful. You've got other segments of society that are not happy, not satisfied, like the slaves. You've got divisions in regards to politics with the various political parties like the Populares and the Optimates, and that even created divisions among some of the patricians themselves. And then you have constant civil war for large periods of time, and you've got very powerful men who command their own armies, and those armies are loyal to those men, their leaders, and not to Rome. So general first, Rome second. That's dangerous. And you also have some of these military leaders who translate their military power into political power. And so they enter the realm of politics with armies behind them. And again, that's dangerous. And we see this, for example, when Sulla fights his way into Rome following the death of Marius, and he ends up seizing power. But out of this, as I said, is going to come the Roman Empire, and it's going to begin a brand new history, or a brand new chapter in Rome's history.